Okay, hello there, Chris.
Hi.
How's it going? So, thanks so much for taking the time to have a little bit of a call today. I'm really excited to talk to you about essentially the incredible work you've done in essentially engaging all sorts of different social audiences all around the world. So I was wondering, I think we're going to get into discussions about the future of social media, what our impact is on our life. But if you could just take it from top and tell me, where are you now?
Yeah, hopefully I can give you some good insights. So at the moment, I'm head of community at a company called Vizzy. It's primarily advertising. So I spend a lot of time creating content for social media to engage audiences that don't necessarily want the content to be in their feed. So no one wants to see a jarring advert at the best of times. So my job is effectively to create content that feels a little bit more organic so people don't realize that they're seeing an advert when they actually are. But to get there, I've gone through a lot of different types of content, worked with a lot of different audiences, and worked on a lot of different platforms.
For any of the listeners knowing, we actually both worked together when we were at Sugru, which was a startup recently acquired by a very big German company called Tesa. And at the time, for anyone who doesn't know Sugru, it's a moldable glue, sometimes described as super glue on steroids or Play-Doh that behaves like Sugru. But either way, we made all these crazy little videos that were explaining a product which nobody understood. And I always remember thinking it's an unusual type of person that says, I want to work for a company to tell something that nobody gets. Yet, of course. And that, for me, was the hook.
Yes.
And I'm pretty sure that was it with you as well.
Yeah, completely. I mean, you had two challenges there. One, you had to create engaging content, but no one understood the product straight off the bat. So you had to do two things at the same time. You had to introduce the product and get people to understand it and effectively get them to watch your video. It's like it's the ultimate question, why should I care? And you had to answer it so quickly.
And I think that's it. I mean, I remember back then people would say like, videos need to be around sort of 3 minutes. And then I remember that going down to like 30 seconds. And then I remember Vine coming out and just being like, oh my God, 6 seconds. It's just completely flipped everything I knew and expected in the world. And I kind of feel, I don't even know where we are now. I mean, obviously there's, the latest thing I can think of, and I'm looking like a granddad, is probably TikTok. But what would you say from having always been immersed in this space? And I think, I should probably add, you've been immersed professionally, but I get the impression you'd do this even if you weren't getting paid. You're just so engaged with and fascinated by this, and that's why I really wanted to talk to you. So tell us a little bit, like, what is going on?
The thing that surprises me most is the trends come and go. So it's gone from back in the day, very high quality polished videos. You wanted to make it as awesome as you possibly could. You had the highest tech equipment, and then suddenly from out of nowhere, people came and they were filming raw on their phone, and unbelievably they were filming in vertical. It's like no one films in vertical. It's like this forbidden fruit, but it's like something your grandma would do while she's trying to film the family. But it became the norm, and it kind of opened up this whole kind of doorway towards much more genuine, authentic content. So people were just filming off the cuff. They weren't rehearsing. They were switching to portrait mode on their camera. They were using the audio built into the phone. And that really allowed like an entire new generation of creators to come forwards. And that's primarily where Vine did so well, and why TikTok is doing so well now.
But then maybe an interesting point is that Vine is obviously not with us. So, I mean, therein is what happened,
Mm-hmm. So, Vine did bite the dust. But the co-founder of Vine actually recently launched another platform called Byte in the hope of kind of reinventing Vine. So they'd always... Because Vine has this iconic status, like people talk about it as high and mighty, YouTube videos are still watched of 6-second Vine compilations where you laugh within the 6-second moment, but you still don't have time to recover before the next one has started. And then you realize you've watched 2 hours of 6-second looping videos. So it does have that magical quality. But kind of where kind of Vine's creative restrictions are maybe what held it back in the end, because platforms like Snapchat came along and Instagram, and they were able to kind of push the boundaries of what was possible. So that you could experiment with overlays, you could experiment with music, you could kind of ultimately, they're more of a social media network. So the digital world is kind of human to human connection, and those platforms allow for conversation back and forth between users when they're creating content, as TikTok is so successful with. But maybe there's more hope for Byte. They're doing one thing right. They're putting the focus on creators. They're saying that they'll support creators with 50% of their ad revenue. So they're actually looking at it as a financial appeal. They're understanding that creators want to make money essentially when they create. So they're kind of going more for that dynamic than more of the conversational tone. They're thinking of it as entertainment.
I mean, one of the things that I guess sort of you often hear is that, you know, our attention is now being commoditized. And so I kind of wonder, there's things like, you know, basic attention token, which for anyone who doesn't know means that essentially if you've seen the Black Mirror episode where someone is having to make a choice between do they watch an advert or do they suffer a financial cost of not viewing the advert, then I think we're already starting to like emerge into that space, but just from the other perspective where you're being paid to read an email, to watch an advert or something like this. So it really does feel like it's not even sci-fi. You know, we're there with our attention being commoditized.
Yeah, and we've seen the introduction of that with unskippable ads. That's the kind of that one thing that you're forced to watch. Most social platforms these days sound on by default. Who saw that coming? This is something you can't escape from. This is something you have to engage with.
And so I guess sort of what do you feel that sort of says about us? Because there's this weird feeling of, you know, the phrase I love is gradually then suddenly. And I think it's a Hemingway quote as regarding our sort of like addictions and vices. And I think it was possibly related to even sort of like, how do you go bankrupt? You know, gradually then suddenly. It is actually a behavioral link, and then suddenly something broke. Your bank manager decided not to bail you out or whatever, or your family had enough. But I kind of feel ultimately is, you know, when we complain about social media's addiction, we're part of the problem, or am I being unfair?
Yeah, it's a great question, because you have to think about why people use social media, and it is addiction is the right word. It has that kind of reward, like the reward from the trigger in your behavior. You're immediately rewarded with attention. You're bombarded with notifications. It reminds you when you're not using it to use it. It's constantly trying to hook you back in. It feels comfortable. The technology is designed to make you want to swipe through more. It's ease of use. You can discover more. You can the way the algorithms work, it'll show you content that you like first. It knows what you like. It knows what you're looking at for the longest. It knows what you're engaging with, and that's where things start to get a little bit dark. But if we think about how third-party cookies work in advertising, whereby if we go on websites and we're retargeted with content that's relevant to us, it can feel a little bit creepy, but at the same time, it's sort of the alternative is random, and that to me just sounds almost as scary. So it's like we kind of accept that this technology knows us, and it's that kind of comfort that keeps us going back.
So I guess one of the things that I've wondered a lot with social media is, and indeed not necessarily when I say social media, I don't necessarily just mean things like TikTok, which are very sort of entertaining and playful, but also quite utilitarian things like LinkedIn. As someone who hasn't had this nice plotted linear career, I find that the way that the algorithm works is it looks at your past. it doesn't spend a lot of time trying to extrapolate who you're going to become. And so sometimes I feel there's always this like inertia of going, can you stop like selling me to people who want product designers, because I've spent 3 years in business strategy now, you know, and new business development, and it becomes really hard to almost pump the algorithm to realize you've changed who you are. And so I feel a like little bit sometimes, how do you hack the algorithm is what I'm saying.
I was reminded of how when you buy a washing machine on Amazon, for the next 2 weeks, it shows you 6 different washing machines every time you log on. So how many washing machines do I need? One. Yeah, it should know I bought one. I don't need one anymore. But yeah, it is a really it's kind of a tricky minefield with this, especially it gets into a lot of ethical questions about how much technology should hold, how much data it should hold on us, and understanding that and using that data for good as well.
Well, because I guess the utopia is that if truly these tech firms had all data on us, you could argue that they might actually be able to tell us something that's truly deep, truly tailored, truly not just what we say we want, but what we need. And yet, of course, we get scared if we said, give everything to those clouds up there and they can do whatever they want, because it feels like a loss of control. So it feels like we always have this Icarus dilemma of or indeed we detest the 1984s, the Big Brothers, the nanny states. But as soon as, they turn around and say, okay, you better read your terms and conditions, you better explore what those presets mean when they say accept all, then of course we click accept. And so, where is it what is the future for companies to say, if legislation doesn't tell us what to do and consumers don't self-regulate, then how is this different from selling washing powder or tobacco or toys or computer games or cars? They all, as soon as you go back to the basics of people like Bernays, Freud's nephew, all marketing is trying to exploit and manipulate our emotions. And I don't mean that in a dystopian sense. At the end of the day, we do all sorts of things which are emotionally engaged. We get married, we have kids. All of these things are, partially in our control and partially not in our control. And yet, that's life. So I guess the journey, it feels like, for sort of future generations is that, how is it that, younger generations today will navigate, should we say, a sort of ethical and responsible social life online?
Yeah, manipulation is a good word, because you could argue that there's good manipulation and bad manipulation. There's, in terms of, advertising relies on emotional hooks and kind of desires, and the way that retargeting works and creative strategy works is that they tap into what is relatable and understanding, and then it's okay. And then there's the bad side of manipulation, where things start to, they know so much about you that they can target you with kind of confirmation bias. So kind of fake news, start trying to just keep you in your box of thinking. For younger generations that are coming through with this, there was a time when it was expected that younger generations could just see through this. They were born of this digital era. This is what they grew up with. They don't buy into traditional advertising. They don't buy into. They can see straight through a brand when they're trying to hijack the conversation instead of be part of it. Because the technology is advancing so quickly and we're having to adapt so quickly, it is difficult for them and difficult for us to kind of understand what is real and what is not.
But in some ways, do you imagine that? I find it strange if we look at people like sort of creators, and there was a time where, ultimately you could let's take Maslow's hierarchy of needs for easy visualization. This is a sort of famous wheeled out thing of saying at the top is self-actualization, where you truly get to sort of live and be the person who you want to be, and people understand you, you have self-awareness, etc. And beneath all that is all the sort of base needs, all the way down to sort of food and water and clothing. And yet it almost feels as if that little nugget on top has sort of slid and skidded down the pyramid, that you can have someone who's like absolutely in zone one, but potentially could be top of their game, self-actualization. They've short-circuited, they've hijacked the system. That back in the day, the noblemen, the lords, the ladies, the priests, the whatever, they had attained very sophisticated high levels of education, social etiquette, acceptance, and now you can have someone who is more influenced in, people. It's not a shock to say that people know celebrities more than they do their local politician. And this isn't me being an old granddad saying that's right or wrong. It's just a fact. And so
it's true. You could be famous for famous sake.
Yeah.
Ultimately. Yeah. And you have these kids that are coming through and doing like new types of media that we'd never thought of before. They're live streaming themselves playing computer games, and then 5 episodes later they're discussing political discourse. And they've got such an engaged audience, and ultimately that comes down to that that human-to-human digital contact. It's ultimately about trust. When you meet someone in real life, it's the same in the digital world. It takes a little bit of time to build that trust, but as soon as you do, you're more likely to see what they're saying is truth. So, and there's a lot of people out there that are just looking for somewhere to belong, and the digital world does give them that, which means you get a lot of influencers that are purely just very ordinary people, just spending a lot of time online selling stories that they may or may not believe in. They just see a gap kind of in the social market.
And I guess it's one of those things that, I guess I'm a bit of a sort of eternal optimist in technology and new things, because it feels like every time I try to be a bit scholarly and I look back in history, maybe I'm being confirmation bias, as you say, but it feels like every new leap of technology, people are either burnt at the stake or flogged, and then it feels like morally we figure out and recalibrate to what is the right, ethical thing, or indeed we become a society who acknowledges that it becomes the new thing. I mean, you could look at the sexual taboos. We now go, well, of course that's reasonable, because we've shifted what was heretical or taboo, and we've reset the goalposts. And so I can't help feeling that a lot of the sort of anxiety that you see in the media, I mean, let's be honest, it's ultimately usually written by people who are of the previous generation. And so I feel you're always in that weird conundrum of the people who truly live it and understand it aren't writing those articles, but at the same time it's reasonable to lay upon them and say they maybe haven't got the perspective of 50, 60 years of life to know whether all of their choices are necessarily going to serve them well later down the line. So I can see both arguments, and I guess to maybe sharpen the question for you, it feels like there's ultimately responses to social media. We can either hark back to the good old days, we can either say fight fire with fire. It's not to say whether I think Trump is a good person or a bad person. Let's just take it as a technical agreement that he understands social media to a surprisingly high level that most traditional politicians had never used in that way. Let's, strip out the opinion, but that is a fact. And so you could fight fire with fire, or indeed you could say you could learn about how the game is played today and raise the bar so it does feel more ethically sound, it does feel more inclusive, it does feel more, not necessarily regulated, but it feels like we're progressing to somewhere where it is a good destination.
Yeah, you could definitely argue that social media platforms should be doing more to protect the audiences. Twitter recently brought in quite a neat function that highlights whenever a video is edited before it's posted, which was hilarious as Donald Trump shared a video that had been edited. And underneath a headline that read something along the line of fact, it said, this video has been edited, which was hilarious. But yeah, it's when it comes to how like yeah, I was going to talk about how like the kind of the pressure on the kids these days to kind of like everyone always talks about how the user is. When we're discussing like fake news and how Donald Trump is using it, people always say that it's up to the user to go and investigate. But really, it's the technology that presents that to them. And people, we can worry about. I'm sorry, I had a great point, but unfortunately, I lost it in the middle of there. But it was so good. I was reminded of something that Donald Trump did. That. A social media platform had reacted to, but it has completely lost me.
Don't worry. But I guess it'll come back to you, I'm sure. But I mean, I guess it's always interesting how, I think Donald Trump has sort of set a different precedent, and you could also say with sort of celebrities and the way that they engage people. I think. In some ways, it's unsettling to the conventional power systems because they go, you're not supposed to have this level of influence because you didn't do it.
Yeah, you're not supposed to have the access.
You didn't do it by the book. And yet, part of me feels like it seems probably sort of impossible to relate to, that my parents, when they look at things like Twitch, think, if I showed them like PewDiePie and said, look, this guy's playing computer games and he's just riffing off it, and that somehow is getting millions of views. I think it is that point of saying, but in all honesty, when you used to go down the pub and chew the fat, let's just be really fair. As much as we like to hark back to those good old days and say, yes, but there was, nuances and you could talk to people. I grew up in Cumbria. The conversations were not high level. They were talking about like what Farmer Giles just did, or like, whose wife is maybe giving like the look to someone else. This was not, intense, discourse. And I think we sometimes over romanticize the past. I always love the Woody Allen film Moonlight in Paris, in that it's sort of for anyone who hasn't seen it, it has this sort of moment where this guy is romanticizing the past, and yet through the manipulations of you have to go with the plot that it has a bit of time travel in it, it becomes very apparent that this is just what human nature always does. We always romanticize the past because we self-edit and we retain the good things, just as the same way the Beatles were amazing, but actually if you really go back look through the discography, there was some utter rubbish as well. The same as with Dylan. And so it feels like, and having had a kid not that long ago, my wife always jokes and says, I can feel it editing the pain and the distress. It goes with every year that passes. I truly forget. And it's clearly the reason we endure as humans is our power to forget. So maybe to throw something in you in a different way, uploading is robbing us of the right to be forgotten and the right to erase your previous stupidities and opinions. Where is this taking us?
Instagram alone has 500 million photo uploads a day at the moment. That's incredible. And like, as well as giving us unfiltered access to celebrities, and you talk about like gossip and that kind of conversational chit chat, we have access to people that we would never have had access to before, and they can talk directly to us. But it's the same for every teenager that's growing up right now. They're posting content online continuously. This is something that leaves a footprint. This will be there forever. And this is a good lesson for adulthood as well. I don't know if you've read Ron Johnson's So You've Been Publicly Shamed. It's
but we'll put a link.
It's an interesting book about people who've done something wrong online. In the normal life, they've said something inappropriate, and the online mob has completely jumped on them. So it's this case of, and it's an interesting thing about social media is, maybe back in the day it would be something feels good, so you keep doing it. With social media, it can sometimes feel bad, but you keep doing it. And that opens a whole other can of psychological worms.
Yeah.
But people do go on social media just to kind of jump on a bandwagon or see what's happening right now. Or who has made a mistake and I can join this mob. It's kind of, it's sort of, the justice system has become democratized. Everyone has a voice now. It's kind of mob rule. The silent majority are no longer silent. They actually have something to connect to.
But do you think
if you
this
make
is
a
almost...
mistake?
No, go on.
Because if you make a mistake, it can ruin everything in a heartbeat, because everything is so public.
I mean, I remember the sort of beginnings of this. It almost felt like with Bill Clinton and the whole Monica Lewinsky thing. I remember, I can't remember what ages it was, but I remember being old enough to just about understand it. But I remember even at that young age thinking, hold on a minute. I get that this guy lied on oath, and that's obviously a really bad thing. But I can empathize with why he might lie about that particular thing. And also, if we look in history, politicians have lied about all sorts of stuff. And it's only when Nixon eventually gets caught that, there's a problem with it. The thing that struck me is the sort of, the sheer sort of high-roading and hypocrisy of people. I mean, when you look at the statistics of divorce, and that's divorce even before we get to affairs, the numbers of affairs that must be undocumented, I thought, it's not that I don't have sympathy for Hillary having to live through that. It's a horrible thing to live through. I'm not in any way condoning it, but just the public, just stoning of this as being like something which we didn't all just go, you're a really lousy guy, but this is a separate issue from how well you do or don't run the country. Mm-hmm. And I feel like we still let Steve Jobs run Apple, even though when you read his biography, he was monstrous to his family. Mm-hmm. And we don't bring him in and say, but you create products which are about a family experience. How dare you? I mean, I absolutely love Roald Dahl. Again, quite monstrous as an individual. Woody Allen, love the films. Really have no time for the person. And so it feels like social media does not help us at times with this, I guess you'd call it cognitive dissonance, or it's almost like a moral dissonance, that we judge people with different expectations than we do ourselves. Why? Just because they've got so many million followers on Instagram, why does that set you suddenly at a different level? I'm not talking about breaking the law and murder. I just mean moral virtues. Why is that so? What's the delta?
Yeah. It's reminded of that Black Mirror episode where you score based on your social interactions. It sort of becomes... It's
maybe just break that down for anyone who hasn't seen that.
Yes, the Black Mirror episode where people have phones to basically rate every single social interaction that you have, and it creates a social score that sets your social standing. And that weirdly was the most realistic one for me, because I could totally see technology going that way. Because
what do you mean?
Over time,
it's happening in China. It already...
yes. Yeah,
it already is happening. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd forgotten about that. It's it's insane. It's suddenly become that your online rating, like the follows that you have and the likes that you get, this has more weight than knowledge, than expertise, than talent and skill. If you and then it goes back to whether you use that for good or bad. I feel like I'm talking so negatively about technology when I actually love it, especially when it comes to creating content online.
No, but I think would you? I mean, we've often shared this point with, and I've seen Charlie Brooker live, making this point that often people assume that because he writes dystopian fiction, and it is fiction, and he puts his hand up about that it being dystopian, he says that his way of viewing it is that if you watched an episode of Black Mirror and you didn't get scared or you didn't feel freaked out, he's like, then as an author, I would worry about humanity. But the fact that you do go, oh my God, that looks terrible, surely that is a reason to be positive about the human, sort of journey, that we can actually tell right from wrong. And I think that's as much as I think it's helpful as a mental exercise, and I hope for anyone listening to this still, that is the intent of this discussion, is to make sense of the problems so that you can go forward with something more positive. And I wouldn't be talking to you if I was here just to give social media a good kicking, because, my granddad could have done that.
You can see how easily it slips this way as well. Like behavior, it's nudge behavior. It's slowly over time, people making ever so slight changes to the way that they use technology. So the greatest thing about like fictional stories like Black Mirror is not only are they scary, but you can see exactly how that would take that route. And you can see it reflected in politics in the way that politics uses social media for their gain.
And I guess maybe just to run with your point a little bit of just, being more positive about social media. I mean, I grew up in Cumbria. It was in the middle of nowhere. One of my best friends came out later on. But when I look back, I just think, God, he really had to go through so much hardship to figure all that stuff out in a very isolated, and it's not to be generalizing about Cumbria. Of course, it's not a uniform, homogenous people. But as someone who is mixed race, I can tell you there weren't so many people of different ethnicities walking down the street. And my mum, who's half Nigerian, still got stuff yelled at her across the street. And that was extremely weird and horrible growing up. And so I can only empathize with that being about, sexual orientation or any other of these things, that when you are in an isolated community, if he had had the internet, I do wonder whether he would have just figured stuff out a little bit quicker or with a little bit more confidence. The fact that he's turned out to be an incredible and lovely person, I think is sort of testament to his parents, who are incredibly, receptive. I should say, for the record, it wasn't the sort of usual movie saga of those things. But I think, gosh, for people who haven't got that fortune of a good family as a foundation, I think people do take on things online.
You can talk about the lone wolves that are like on the internet, in the far right, that think they're on their own and suddenly find a voice. But that's because they shout the loudest when they're online. What it really is it's an incredible tool for discovery, and not just finding things, but finding yourself and finding people who are like you as well. It's that conversational element that is wonderful. And that's where social platforms really thrive. If you can get conversation flowing in very niche communities, so you can talk about content creators that don't necessarily have a lot of followers, but what they do is so valuable for maybe a small group of people, but that's just as strong as, if not stronger, than someone who just spouts nonsense at 6 million followers for gimmick purposes. Because you make like a huge impact on those individuals that you actually do manage to reach.
I think we know that there's some interesting changes around the way. I mean, you can see the shift in algorithm sort of responses, that before on YouTube it just used to be all about the clicks and all just about sort of eyeballs, and yet you notice now things are quite distinctly driven by also sort of the duration that people watch things, the engagement. And so it's not about sort of channel hopping all the time and jumping around. It is about saying, are you getting truly a quality experience in your viewing? And I think even though there are many things we can talk about negatively about TikTok, and I'm happy to, sort of acknowledge those, but I do think there's something actually quite refreshing about its algorithm saying, Instagram says, if you've got a lot of followers, we're going to give you a lot of airtime because you must be important. TikTok does not depend on that notion at all. You can come from 0 followers and you can develop something which is, for want of a better word, a meme that can be shared and understood and riffed off and remixed by people.
Yeah.
And that becomes the most powerful thing. Now, I'm happy to caveat and say that it's still about getting attention, but I do think it's slow progress, but that is really meaningful progress to say it is non-hierarchical. It is about it's about the thing. And I do think, what other examples do you feel you've started to see incremental shifts in should we say a higher quality or a higher intelligence of our attention?
Yeah, I mean, have you heard of the app Quibi?
Nope.
It's a little bit of a revolutionary mobile streaming platform. Not to go back, talking of attention span, it's for content that's easily digestible, so under 10 minutes. They call it quick bites, so they're thinking the kind of thing you lean into while you're on a morning commute, or you've got 5 minutes while you're waiting for a friend. But it's quite revolutionary technology because it's interactive. So it's shot vertically and in landscape, both audio and visual, and you can switch between the two while you're watching shows. So it kind of opens up a whole new world of content. And that's kind of that, like taking a risk. I mean, they've released this app. They don't really know if this is something that anyone's going to engage with. But that's the brilliant thing about creative technology is you can take risks. It's about creative exploration. So it's, the apps that perform best, I think, are the ones that really kind of take it to the next level. The ones that, you'll always have ones that fall back, maybe like Fine. But in terms of some of the things that TikTok are doing, like you say, rewarding the people who make, as my teenage sister put it, banging content.
I believe that's the technical term as well.
I think so. I think it's probably in digital best practices.
Yeah.
Because they're pushing the boundaries of what's actually possible. And it's funny that you used the word remix, because that's exactly how I kind of see the success of platforms like TikTok. It's sort of reimagining the original content and then riffing off it and then sending it back to the original owner. So everyone who creates content then has a whole community of people creating content, and then it just floods like a wave, a little bit like how a meme spreads.
Yeah, but I think that's actually the thing that, dare I say it, you think you're in a new paradigm, and then you realize, hold on, we just used a term that remixed. Where did that come from? It came from the music industry. The music industry, of course, ushered in a new wave of experimentation, and then they went through this legal point of going, hold on, when a DJ mixes something, who's supposed to get the rights to that? And of course, they did the most base thing, which is to say, that's theft. You sampled something without permission. And also, by the way, you're not entitled to artistic license because what you created isn't creative. It isn't unique. And I mean, of course, like anyone who grew up through that generation went, there's a big difference between listening to a stack of CDs on a playlist and having someone create a mix. And we all know the difference between shuffle and a curated experience, because you don't go to a museum and then just buzz around like a fly and expect it to be an enjoyable day. And so I guess where I'm going with this is it always feels like we fight the remix of something because someone ultimately from the old system wanted to keep the money. And yet I love, as you said, the fact that TikTok is saying, oh, we've been here before, so let's actually do it right. I guess the question that I'm always saying is, if that's what happened to music and video, GIFs, memes, what's interesting about these aren't like music, which is usually created by people who are experts. This is something created by non-experts, even though they become increasingly good. So it is the Maslow thing, that the top is getting pushed down the side.
Yeah.
And I feel really excited about that actually we're allowing creativity to not just be beholden to the people who've gone to university or have had creative parents who've instilled all these values in them. I mean, where do you think those cracks that are starting to appear, where will they end?
Yeah, it's the argument as to whether or not anything posted on social media is public ownership, where things that, yeah, you get people posting things on Twitter and suddenly they'll end up in the local newspaper.
Who owns that?
Yeah, who do they have a right to just keep reposting content? There was recently an artist who took Instagram posts with interesting comments, framed them and sold them, and did an exhibition, and owned the rights to all of the content. Made quite a lot of money from it.
Because surely the person who said it should be able to say that was my copyright.
Yeah.
And we haven't got a lawyer in the room, so did you ever find out, like, what is the legal perspective on the terms and conditions in Twitter? Is it your copyright or not?
I think you can say no if they ask. No, but I don't.
Okay.
It might be a moral thing.
So it's almost like Creative Commons. It's saying you put it out there, it is what it is, you know? Huh.
And there was a copyright challenge with memes as well, but I'd have to investigate that further.
I think that got a lot of knives stuck in it by basically the entire world of advertising, because they're like, this is going to be bad for everyone. But I guess maybe to expand on that, could you actually tell a little bit about the story? Because where I'd love to jump off that with is this thing of saying, actually, how do we track and remunerate creativity? So could you just maybe begin at the beginning for anyone who doesn't know that nugget?
How do we track?
No, the story, sorry, of where that got to with the industry and memes, just for anyone who doesn't know the history of that.
I can tell you about the history of memes.
Sorry, no, I just meant the fact that it was in contention as whether the copyright of memes, how that would play out in court. Just for anyone who doesn't know that. Sorry, I was asking in a terrible way.
No, it's cool. I'm not too aware of how it finished, but I remember that there was a meme of... didn't it start with a monkey that took a picture of itself?
Yeah.
Yeah, and then...
And that became a sort of
they had
big
to decide
debate.
whether the monkey owned the copyright to the photo or whether the photographer owned the copyright to the photo. And then... then
it sort of created this backlash of actually, well, now we're reconsidering everything in industry of who actually owns it. Is it the person who presses the shutter? And so I guess, to skip to the end for anyone who got lost there, I guess what we're saying is, you know, what is creativity in a digital landscape? Where do you think it's going?
Whether it's... I think... it's
easy questions always, Chris.
I wouldn't know where it's going. If I knew that, I'd be rich.
Well, this is it. But I mean, like, it's sometimes these discussions, and I feel like no one asks these questions on, should we say, TV shows, because the answer is nuanced. Alternatively, if you give a glib answer, then it's unhelpful. So
the great thing when you're making creative content is it's like, will this work? We don't know. Let's try it. And that's the great thing about social media is you can really throw a lot at the wall. You can take risks. You can explore creatively. You can launch a lot of diverse, different types of content. You can test image against image. You can test video against video. You can experiment with like music overlays, subtitles. You can really play around. You can, and I think that's where a lot of social media kind of content is born. If you go back through some of the most popular influencers on Instagram, at the beginning, they're just throwing all sorts and seeing what works. And then that when it does work, that's when they start to elaborate on it a little bit further. I have a friend who's an artist, a 3D artist, spends a lot of time just very quickly kind of exploring different avenues. We'll share them with his community. As soon as people start reacting positively to something, he'll do more of it. And therefore he feels like instead of him just throwing content into the ether, he's actually having a two-way conversation with the people that actually like his content. So it's really, I think, the creative limits are are boundless.
I mean, it's weird when you look back at art, is that it's often assumed that artists are somehow a sort of a one-way outpouring of creativity. And yet, even when you look at someone like Picasso, you realize he spent considerable hours in his day just riffing and sparring with his peers, as well as people who were not, in his exact discipline. And you realize he was not operating in a vacuum at all. And so it's equally as legitimate for someone to say, well, where does my creative individualism, end, and my response to the community and audience that I have evolved with begin? Because after a certain point, there must be times where people wake up, and I mean, it probably does feel a bit Dylan Goes Electric, where you go, wait, I gotta kill these people who have believed in me and indeed informed a lot of my choices creatively, and now I have to turn to the side and go in a different direction. And I think there's actually very little, should we say, literature, and I guess it's back to come full circle to my LinkedIn point. There's not much about saying how do you change tack in creative and social lives.
It's a fine line between art and entertainment. It's sort of like, do I do what I want to do because I think I'm making a difference and changing the world? Or do I find a gap that is in the market there where there's an audience that wants what I'm offering? I had my friend Neil Kelso, who's a very good magician, once said that engaging, to begin with engagement is a promising intrigue. So it's... which was a wonderful way of phrasing it. It's saying it's tapping into people's personal desires. So whether that's like love or their dreams, or they're just looking for laughter, it's kind of understanding exactly what the audience want and create the challenge is creating content that matches that, because that's where the hook will come. And if you have a niche field, then you're away.
It's so interesting that you mentioned magic, as it's something that I've just been getting into recently, not as in the doing it myself, but speaking to psychologists around magic. And I think one of the things that, certainly when I was working at Lego, I spent a lot of time just thinking quite deeply on the subject of contradictory emotions, in that, if why do we enjoy roller coasters? It's actually terrifying, but it's fun for some reason. And, why even literally do we enjoy horror movies? And I remember Mark Commode said something which was rather nice, of that he said, that moment in a horror movie that makes you jump out of your seat, it's not actually fear. It's the release of the tension of the fear that had been building for 20 minutes. And the reason I use that as an example is that same thing operates in magic. If you just went up and went, rabbit, there's just no fun, right, in that, because there was no build-up, there was no suspense. And so it feels like, weirdly, as humans, we have to play this game of going on a journey to then have something, pay off as a sort of a climactic event. And you see this in literature, you see it in music, it's everywhere you see it. Once you start seeing it, you see it everywhere. And so I wonder... storytelling. Exactly. It's like, Kurt Vonnegut's, curves of how stories all have basically very, very similar, or at least fundamental arcs that we crave as humans. And so I guess to bring it back to social media, is it really just an extension of us figuring out how to make sense of life? And we've in the past, we've done this with religions. It helps us understand the things we don't know experientially. We've turned to science, which has been important, of course. And then what is the evolution of our social dynamic that is changing as well? It all feels like it's one big experiment. We're pressing buttons to see what happens, Yeah. And the younger generation are leading it. They're by the end of this year, I think almost half of consumers on the internet will be under the age of 25. So it'll be these under 25s running the world, and everyone else chasing behind them, trying to make things stick. So what
it's definitely going to be a learning curve.
what would just, and it's not to say that this has a snappy answer to it, or indeed it's going to be easy, but forgive me for asking it, but what do you feel on a more practical level have been good examples to either create good social media platforms, or indeed how better to navigate things? Or is it just individual and there is no point trying to fit it? That's by definition folly.
Yeah. I am much more a fan of the active social media platforms. So the ones that allow you a little bit more control. So where you can opt into content. Like Snapchat is really wonderful for this, because you can scroll through a feed and decide what you want to engage with if you choose to. It doesn't so much as rely on technology to kind of throw things at you, which means like TikTok is a little bit more passive. They can like really maybe manipulate you in the way that they show you content. I prefer to kind of scroll through and actively engage. But that's what's wonderful about social media, is there are different types for different people. Not saying that I'm on Snapchat sharing cat filter videos with everyone, but and that's really what content creators should be doing. They should be finding their audience and going to them, instead of trying to get the audience to kind of come and find you.
And I guess that's such an interesting thing of sort of signaling and how you find things. I mean, it's interesting that it feels like whenever you see things like Kickstarter, it struck me that a lot of the ingredients of how Kickstarter worked was also about who had already a good social media following. And so it would sort of catapult it into being funded in usually the first couple of days. So I wonder, do you think there's other mechanisms for how, new platforms will emerge? I mean, I think the gaming industry is an interesting one, because it's just so busy doing its thing with an entirely different set of rules. I mean, do you think there's any other industries that are also sort of ripe for disruption, or indeed, not to be crystal ball, that you see are changing already?
Gaming is an interesting one, just because like just very recently it overtook the music industry, the UK, as for like grossing. So they're making more money. And they do, I think the great thing about gaming communities is they evolve on different platforms separate to the industry. So they have this completely engaged, very high tech company that are trying to community that are actually looking to engage, and they'll find a place that it works, and it will just work. I think where we'll see the real growth is kind of in those communities that are not as tech literate. So I think you'll just recently, in response to kind of coronavirus lockdown, you've seen a lot more kind of localized apps becoming a lot more prominent, and this is something that people have been trying for a little while. There's quite a few out there, but what they really needed was that kind of maybe something to go wrong to push them over the edge, to get that increase of users. And because people ultimately, we've stretched way too thin sometimes, and we're all consumed by global news and global communication. We get hounded multiple apps. People are trying to bring it closer and closer and closer to home, so they can get more face-to-face. So they can feel a little bit more at home, mostly for their well-being. I think people are realizing over time that being digital is it's not the be-all and end-all. And that's when you create, and we see that in quite a lot of content that's being created. Ultimately, it always comes back to the physical or higher engagement within the community.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know why this popped into my head, but I remember, I forgot what book I was reading, but I remember a wife being very, very pointed about a husband, just sort of, should we say, in having wandering eyes. and she said something that really struck with me, of just a sort of curt phrase of like, it's okay to whet your appetite out there in the world, but you still dine at home. And I remember, that was very sort of like a British phrasing of something which would, in other places be said more explicitly. But I kind of feel there's almost a bit of that, would you say, in social media, in that maybe you get to try facets of yourself that you're just not sure, is that me? Is that how I should be? Can I say this? Can I be that person? But you still go back to sort of actually a village tribal unit. You truly probably only have like 5 to 10 people who you really consider dear friends, who actually, you've had a real moment with. But of course, there's this big sphere of other connections. And I guess where I'm going with this as a question is just, I feel when I was watching Ready Player One, and actually I read it before the film, strangely, which is rare for me. But I actually felt there was clearly a polarity in people who thought, oh God, I would never want to upload myself like that. It sounds awful. But then part of me felt maybe you never felt that this world didn't satisfy you or didn't get you. And I mean, I think that's what a lot of the film was trying to sort of provoke. And I think the book did spend more time navigating the moral maze than the film, but I still think for a popcorn film, it was a hell of a good ride. But I guess my question is really just as we had the swinging 60s, is this the era of the sort of, I don't know, the digital exploration of a self and maybe a collective, which at the end of the journey, sure, it's going to have some casualties, just as the swinging 60s sure as heck did. We're going to have casualties as well, but is it possibly? I would like to think that we might transcend something. We might go beyond the likes and the hearts and move into something that, as you said, it took Corona, sadly, to make people come home. But maybe we all are just pausing for a minute, going, "Yeah, there's some good things here, isn't there?"
Yeah, as some people feel more at home online than they ever do in real life, because they can be maybe not who they want to be, but who they feel they really are. It's kind of there's an opportunity to brand yourself, which is a weird thing. To think as a person, to think, okay, how am I going to portray myself in this scenario? Self-editing, like the way that people post on social media. You can take the time to think about what you're saying and how you're saying it and how it will be conveyed, which you can't necessarily do in real life. And then for kids, this is a whole other level of pressure, because you have to go to school the next day. If you're thinking about how you're portrayed online, and I can't imagine the pressure on kids that having to think about that is kind of overwhelming. But there's a lot of good there. I mean, you can. It opens up elements of creativity that people have probably never really thought about, or the opportunity to. I don't think there's anything disingenuous about people branding themselves in certain ways, as long as they feel true to themselves.
I mean, do you think a classic industry that has understood this way before social media is the comedy industry? I mean, I think, people like, sort of provocative names from sort of Bill Hicks through to, Dave Chappelle, all these people, you can't help but feel that especially just coming to mind, people like, Frankie Boyle. I think people often confuse whether Frankie Boyle, the stand-up comedian, is a persona, which Frankie Boyle, the human being, crafts as a mechanism to tackle issues which he, as a sort of member of society, would not do. And I think it's sometimes unfair how we attack and chastise comedians when ultimately I've never met or never known a comedian who isn't trying to do something that he or she feels is progressively good. It's weird that as much depravity and as much cynicism and as much aggression as it might be on stage, when you get them in a like an interview or something, or just talk to them, they're just wanting to go beyond pain, usually, into something better.
Yeah.
I just feel that's always been the case.
That ability to act, it's a little bit like being anonymous online. You have that maybe freedom to do things that you wouldn't be able to do otherwise. I know although in that same regard, I once saw a Stuart Lee set where he spent a good 10 minutes telling the audience that they were useless and were too stupid to understand his jokes. And then I saw a Daily Mail review a little bit later that said, I don't know why anyone would watch this guy. He has complete contempt for his audience. Just not understanding the multifaceted.
I'll confess that I'm a big Stuart Lee fan as well, actually. And
he's wonderful.
I got too scared to say hi to him when he walked into one of the corner shops, and I just went all girly and stupid and just looked at my feet. But he also looked like he'd had a really hard day and just wanted to like get whatever he was going to get and go home. And I kind of actually despise people who don't give people like that space. So I felt I had to live and die by those morals, even though I was
I've been there.
Yeah. But I kind of feel actually that's an interesting one of saying, I mean, when I look back at sort of, all these different facets of our sort of humanity, I feel that is this a generation that when you say you're truly able to have not just one life that to your friends or to your family, but multiple lives. I mean, I'm always reminded of this phrase when I was out in Japan, which was that, I'm going to try and remember it properly, but forgive me that it's a man, it was obviously applying to women as well, but it said there's a side of a man that is known to his workforce, there's a side of a man that's known to his family, and there's a side of a man that only he himself sees. And of course, some people might be quick to jump on that as quite a dark thing because of, some of the things which are considered socially a little bit contentious out in Japan. And I think there's reasons to say having a sort of a bottled up persona which is maybe destructive is not a good thing. But I think that would be missing the point of the philosophy to say that there are some journeys we as humans walk alone. There are some journeys we walk with close family. There are some journeys we walk with total strangers who become allies through a process and a journey. And for me, I felt that was the correct interpretation. I mean, heck, if you're allowed to interpret scripture, I'm going to interpret that the way I feel is positive as well. So I guess my question is really just, it feels like we're giving new generations tools to act, to experiment, to emulate, to run in completely different contrary directions. But do you feel that it is ultimately helping us discover something that previous generations never could access?
I feel as though people are more, especially people that use social media, are more engaged with society as a whole. It can often feel a little bit too much like an echo chamber. I guess you could worry that it'll segment us more. Like we'll just end up hearing the same voices that we like to hear. Confirmation bias thing will naturally move towards following people that ultimately think the same way we do, because everyone likes to hear their own opinions kind of bounce back towards them, makes you feel validated. But I just think ultimately it's the internet, isn't it? It's a tool. It comes back to technology. It is more like I work with a community of 7,000 creators. Over half of them are self-taught. Their industry is adapting so quickly that they keep up to date on like trends and digital best practices just by watching YouTube, which is something I could never have done as a kid. I would have had to. I remember paying through the roof of Dreamweaver and trying to build a website using Flash, bit by bit, using some manual that I printed off 140 pages. I thought my mum was going to kill me. But now people, and there are people who share their expertise and skills for free. There are people that have communities where you can talk about what you've learned, and you've gone through the process. You've made the mistakes prior to someone else who will then take the baton from you and go and make their own mistakes. So everyone together is working, much more unified than we have in the past, which is kind of exciting that you could get someone from Argentina and someone from France working together on a single project, probably just by discovering each other on a forum or a social media platform where you see, it's kind of that element where you see something and you think, how did that person do that? And then you can go and find it because you also want to do it. And if that's like a TikTok dance or just adding overlays to your image, or you're having a Skype call with a friend and they've got tiger ears and you're like, wait, how are people doing this? It kind of pushes you to go and out of your comfort zone, and then you teach that to the next person. It's kind of someone else will see that, and that, I mean, it's quite a simple. Cat ears are a simple idea, but it works on a much greater, more niche scale. Like you're talking about people learning motion design, they're pushing the boundaries of what's possible with motion design because they're sharing videos of motion design that people are saying, how the hell did they do that? And then people are starting conversations because direct access is there, which is something never really had in the past. Like in the 90s when I was watching footballers do insane things, the only way I could learn to do that would be through a football coach. I couldn't go online and watch a how-to video on how to score the most wonderful free kick, hence why my football career ended in dismay with me missing a penalty in the 88th minute of the semi-final when I was 15 years old. Never lived it down.
Oh no.
But yeah.
But I think in some ways that's like a lovely point to finish on, really, of just that we learn so much about ourselves and each other through inspiring each other. And I really do think that is the high point, you know, that we can achieve is I mean, without being too grandiose, it's sort of the greatest thing is to love and be loved, and I kind of feel creatively the greatest thing is to inspire and be inspired. So I feel that this is just yet another paintbrush in the journey. So thank you so much for your time, Chris. It's been incredible.
Worries. Thank you very much for talking with me.
And I really love just coming at things from all different angles. And thank you for rolling with what I know is and indeed the listener, an unscripted thing. But I think sometimes it's just worth, when you haven't got clean answers, it's sometimes just worth being honest and going through these things. And so it's I respect the candor and going with it. So thank you so much.
No worries. Thank you.
Have a good one. Take care.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.